Hello and good afternoon to our next webinar. I want to welcome every one of our listeners to a very interesting topic today. We will speak about the topic, are your diagnostic tests eventually already in-house tests? The goal of this session today is to speak a little bit about different scenarios which could occur in the in-house topic. Just to remember, the in-house topic is coming with the IVDR, and this is in many cases very relevant to laboratories who are creating in-house or lab-developed tests. I would like to introduce ourselves. My name is Andreas Oberleitner. I am responsible for quality management and regulatory affairs here at Platomics, a company which is located in Vienna, Austria. And with me, I brought my colleague.
Hello and welcome also from my side to today's webinar. My name is Valerie Wohlgenannt, and here at Platomics I am working as a regulatory affairs manager, and in this role I'm responsible for anything regulatory related in regards to in-house IVDs.
Wonderful. Before we start, I would like to talk a little bit about some housekeeping rules. This webinar is going to be recorded, so everyone who is registered would then later be provided with a link to this recording, and this will also be placed on our YouTube channel. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free and don't hesitate to put them into our questions and answers section. Zoom provides this one as a functionality down in your in the bar of the functions. Okay, and I think with that we are ready to go. Today's agenda, we will talk first of all about the definition of different scenarios of an in-house IVD. We very often hear about the term in-house IVD, but we also need to consider that there might be different levels of complexity, levels of scrutiny within such a scenario, because the scenarios all might be different. For that, we will also talk a little bit about the definition of an in-house device itself, just to pick up everyone and bring us all on the same page. Next, we will talk about typical requirements. So based on the different scenarios, we will have a quick chat on what we do have to do on these scenarios, and probably also get away with a few recommendations for each of these scenarios. Last but not least, we also want to present a little bit how we at Platomics tackle this problem. We see it, how we see it, and also how we could probably help you in getting further on this topic. All right, just a few words about Platomics, our company. We are a Vienna-based company developing software as a service products in the regulatory affairs domain. So with that software products, we aim to help laboratories and also manufacturers in the domain of the diagnostic world, especially IVDR related topics, in accomplishing and facilitating their tasks to get compliant and also to create technical documentations and similar things. Yeah, we already serve a lot of labs on our platform, and this number is continuously growing. Good. So before we can really dig into the topic, I think we first need to define what is an in-house IVD, because this is the centerpiece of the discussion today.
Exactly. So an in-house IVD, if you could go to the next slide, please. So an in-house IVD is basically a test that is manufactured and also used only within one specific health institution. And those tests are typically used when there is no suitable CE-IVD alternative on the market. So meaning that those tests are used when the commercial alternative simply is not good enough to meet the specific needs of the patient. And it is also important to highlight, once you are manufacturing and using an in-house IVD, those are then regulated by Article 5.5 of the IVDR. And as a health institution, you then have to comply with the requirements of the IVDR. And those would include topics such as the GSBRs in Annex 1, and also the standard ISO 15189, which is the gold standard for quality management system in medical laboratories.
Interesting. So you said that it is regulated by the IVDR in this Article 5.5, but there are also some differences, right? So it's not the case that you need to follow the whole IVDR because it's more towards IVDR manufacturers, but you have to at least focus on this article. But there are, of course, differences, as we probably all know, that for an in-house device, there is no notified body involved. There is no pre-market approval formulated within these requirements. It's rather post-market control, let's say. Of course, the requirements differ a little bit. Still, it's an exemption, right? So you see it still as a privilege.
Yes, exactly. So in general, the notified bodies actually do not play a role in the in-house IVD area, but the ones who are responsible for overseeing the in-house IVDs are the competent authority of the respective member state. And it also should be mentioned that you are only allowed to use the in-house privilege if you are a health institution. And this means that your organization has the primary purpose of which is the treatment or also the care for patients. And it is also important to highlight that the definition of a health institution actually depends on the national legislation. And this means that the specific definition of a health institution might also differ between the different member states.
Interesting. So you need to be careful here also when it comes to the definition. So in general, there is a definition. It for sure also includes some exclusions. For example, I don't know, a spa or a gym is not a health institution in the meaning of the IVDR, but you still need to be careful that potentially there might be more details even in your national legislation. That's interesting. Yeah, I think we talked a lot about the details on what an in-house and a health institution is already in other webinars. So everyone who is interested to learn more about that, please feel free also to look it up on our website or on our YouTube channel. But for me now, it would be interesting to see you talked about the in-house IVD as being a device or a test, right? So, but in many cases, I think we are also sending specimens, for example, to a laboratory. And this is not happening within the in-house, within the health institution who is creating the in-house device. So what is your take here?
Exactly. So in general, so as mentioned, there is this overarching term of an in-house IVD, but it also should be mentioned that when it comes to patient specimens, those are actually not considered in-house IVDs. And this is also the case for the delivery of the results. So the reading of the results should occur in the same health institution that manufactures the in-house IVD, but there's actually no problem at all with sharing the results of the in-house IVD. And also it is important to note that a protocol is also not considered an in-house IVD. And this protocol can be in the form of a written procedure, so either in paper or also in a digital format. And for those protocols, it is also no problem at all to share those between different health institutions.
Yeah, very interesting. So, but at the end, it makes sense because the IVDR is dealing with devices. It's interested in devices itself. So in either the physical devices like a kit or an instrument, or also software as a more or less not physical device. But as you said, so everything, for example, the specimens from human patients, but also the results. So these things, those are not devices themselves. Therefore, they cannot be an in-house device, right? They cannot be deemed an in-house device. And these things you can also share among the health institutions, for example. So this is also very interesting because that means that, for example, the setup or the plan how to set up an in-house device itself could be shared as well, right?
So the in-house device itself is only used within the specific health institution. So this is very important, and this is also one of the criteria that defines an in-house IVD. So those are not allowed to be shared, basically.
The devices, yes, but the plan how to build it. So to explain, okay, I took a device and combined it with another one, like a template, let's say, or an SOP. This for sure can be shared, right? And this is already happening I think this is very interesting because laboratory can share this information with other laboratories. The only thing which is not allowed is really physically hand over the devices themselves, right? With software, if it's a software as a service, if it's a diagnostic software, then of course you also need to be careful not to share it, because otherwise you would more or less violate the rule of sharing it with other laboratories as well. Okay, so that means we know now what an in-house device is and what is for sure not an in-house device, and how those elements play together. Now I'm interested in, we have different situations. Are all of these devices feeling the same? We talked about instruments and we talked about kits, etc. But also the setup itself, how it comes to an in-house device. So how does it look like? What are these different approaches or scenarios?
So as mentioned, there's this overarching definition of an in-house IVD, which is that an in-house IVD is a test that is manufactured and used only within one specific health institution. However, if you are having a closer look, there are actually some nuances to the in-house IVD term. And in order to clarify this term, 5 different scenarios have been created. And the first scenario is actually simply added for a better delineation of the other scenarios, because in the first scenario, a situation is described where a health institution would simply use an already existing CE-IVD and use it as instructed by the manufacturer. So basically, there is no in-house IVD. And for the remaining scenarios, so scenario 2 to 5, all of those would describe an in-house IVD. And this then means that the health institution needs to comply with Article 5.5 of the IVDR. And also, it is important to highlight that the amount of the documentation and also the level of complexity differs between those scenarios. And as you can see, this is also already indicated by the color scheme. So scenario 2 is also known as the light way of an in-house IVD, and then when it gets to scenario 5, this is also known as the heavy in-house IVD case, basically.
Okay, so you're saying that we have definitely different types of scenarios here. So how these scenarios look like, we will hopefully see, because I'm already very curious to learn more about this. But that also means that there is a scenario which is not an in-house device, which is just applying the CE-marked devices. Maybe we can start with that one. Would you like to dive a little bit into the different scenarios?
So let's have a look at the first one. So as mentioned, this scenario describes the situation where a health institution uses a CE-IVD basically exactly as intended by the manufacturer. And this is then in regards to the intended use, the application, the quality control, also in regards to parameters such as the storage and the maintenance. And all of those are basically carried out in accordance with exactly what the manufacturer intended. And an example for this scenario would be a PCR procedure in which a CE-IVD PCR kit, a CE-IVD reagent for the quality control, and lastly, a CE-IVD PCR thermocycler are used in accordance with the specific instructions. And in this scenario 1, as mentioned, Article 5.5 is not applicable because this simply describes the use of a CE-IVD as intended.
Okay, so that means that every device anyways is a CE-IVD device. So therefore, a manufacturer has already done the whole work on certifying the product, proving the efficacy, the efficiency, and also the safety of the device. And it also fulfills already the IVDR. By the way, CE-IVD, we are still in the transition phase with many devices. So CE-IVD might also include CE-IVDs under the old directive as well. So IVDR or IVDD devices are still seen as equivalent from the regulatory or from the legal perspective. But we have transition periods on that, which you need to consider, of course, as a manufacturer as well. Okay, you said this is the case which is not in-house, but what are now the cases for the in-house scenarios?
So scenario 2 is describing a situation where there is a deviation from the manufacturer's instructions for CE-IVD. So this means that the health institution is still using a CE-IVD, but uses it outside of the manufacturer's intended purpose. So this could be, for example, with regards to the matrix that is used, or also in regards to the volume and the intended purpose. And examples for this would be the use of a PCR kit for a matrix that is not mentioned in the original package insert, or another off-label use would be to adapt the sample types or also use alternative patient groups and also extend the clinical indications. And the last example is also an interesting one. So the use of reagents after the defined expiry date would also already fall into scenario 2. And this means that the health institution needs definitely to comply with Article 5.5.
Okay, so to sum it up, normally the manufacturer provides us with a nice statement on the intended purpose, right? So everyone who is interested in learning more about intended purpose, we have also trainings and webinars for this topic, by the way. But this intended purpose statement consists of several elements, right? So for example, you mentioned a matrix, or you mentioned the purpose itself, the clinical purpose, or maybe also some change in specimen types which you want to apply here. So every change in each of these elements would trigger that this device now is seen as an in-house device from the outside. And that means that the laboratory needs to take care and also takes over the responsibility at the end, right, for this part. And they need to decide what to do then. Okay?
Exactly. And in the next scenario, when in-house IVD is described, this would be the situation where a health institution uses products without CE marking. So for example, research use only products. And it should be highlighted that in order for a product to be labeled as in research use only, it must not have any medical purpose or objective. So if the health institution then decides nevertheless to go forward and use this IUO product in diagnostics, the health institution then formally changes the intended use of this product and is then considered an in-house IVD. And it's also very important to highlight that in the event of damage, the health institution is liable and solely responsible, as they become basically the manufacturer of this in-house IVD. And the manufacturer of the IUO product has actually no market surveillance at all. So responsibility for market surveillance, and also the manufacturer does not have to prevent the product from being used as an in-house IVD. And examples for this scenario would be that the health institution uses an IUO sequencing panel, or maybe also IUO reagents for special stains.
I see. I think this case of using RUO devices is pretty common in some areas, pretty widespread. RUO, as you mentioned, means research use only. Therefore, this is already a certain intended purpose, right? It is for research use only, claimed by the manufacturer. And that means that, of course, if you change this purpose, and this is, I think, the similarity to scenario 2, you're changing the purpose of this device to a diagnostic one. And with that, automatically you become the de facto manufacturer, taking over the responsibility on this device, even without having a hand on the manufacturing process itself, because you're still buying that typically from an external manufacturer.
Exactly. And in the next scenario, so scenario 4, this is the situation where a health institution would combine devices that are originally, according to the manufacturer's specifications, not intended to be used for such a combination. And then this entire new system is created with an in vitro diagnostic purpose. And this means that usually the entire system is then the new device, and the health institution is responsible for the end-to-end process. And an example for this scenario would be the combination of a CE-IVD library preparation kit with a CE-IVD sequence and an open source analysis software. And as mentioned, this scenario only appears if the combination is originally not intended by the respective manufacturer.
Okay, I mean, in workflows, we typically see that we are not using only one device. Typically, we are using several devices. And I think we need to go back to the term device, because the IVDR, again, still is only interested in the devices, not necessarily everything around, so the workflow. But the devices themselves in combination constitute a system, more or less. And if that system is described by the manufacturer and provided in the IFU, for example, then all good. But if you, for example, change one component and say, okay, you're using the kit with a different sequencer or an instrument, for example, a different reader, then you're building a new system. And that again means that you take over the responsibility that this system really works at the end and is also, again, safe and effective for a given purpose.
Exactly. And then basically becoming the manufacturer of this new system. And in scenario 5, so the last scenario, this describes the genuine in-house development of an in-house IVD. So this means that the health institution manufactures a completely new in-house IVD from scratch, based on raw materials, components, or other parts of a device. And compared to the previous scenarios, so in this scenario, there is actually a development and manufacture of an in-house IVD that takes place. And that then means that the health institution is almost comparable to the role of a commercial manufacturer. And specific examples for these scenarios would be the programming of an own bioinformatic software pipeline. Also, another example would be the developing of an own ELISA based on raw materials, or even the creation of Excel formulas for diagnostic applications would also fall into this scenario.
Very interesting. So originally, the IVDR talked about manufacturing of in-house devices. And if someone thinks of manufacturing, I think everyone is first thinking exactly of such a case. Manufacturing, really putting something together, creating your own, programming your own software, or maybe mixing your own reagents, assembling your own kits, etc. So really with the, let's say, physical part of doing the manufacturing. We learned also in the other scenarios that it very often only comes with repurposing, redefining. But here, this I think is the most complex case, and it really sounds like a very, let's say, very close to a manufacturing process a normal IVD manufacturer would also face at the end, right? Because you're really thinking of how to design it, how to create it, how to manufacture it, how to do the quality checks, and then bring it into the usage. And at the same time, you're also the user here, this one. The second aspect you mentioned is also interesting, that even the adoption or creation of Excel formulas, because here at the end it's clear, right? Because you're entering formulas, and this can be done maybe over macros or in cells with algorithm likes or rule-based entries. And at the end, it's a very simple example, but still you need to validate it, right? And also ensure that no misinterpretation can happen, no misuse, or maybe no wrong entries can happen, etc. Right?
Exactly. So now that we have looked at all of those scenarios in a very theoretical way, it would be nice to, as a next step, look at the practical side of it. So now that I have identified my in-house IVD, what are the next steps?
I think that's the good point. And as usual, this depends. This depends on the scenario and also your own setting, etc. But starting with the first scenario we talked about, which is the one which is not an in-house IVD, so the pure usage of CE-IVDs in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. And this is really important to not deviate in a single step from the manufacturer's instructions. In that case, of course, the health institution does not have to meet any requirements from this Article 5.5 out of the IVDR. However, normally the IFU, the instructions, also provide you with exact handling steps. So what to do, for example, to do the implementation and also the integration in your environment. then you typically would do kind of an installation qualification, might also be the classical verification steps you need to do, just to prove that the device works as intended by the manufacturer also in your own environment. So this is normally provided within the manufacturer's instructions. Typically, you also have your own quality management system, in many cases based on, for example, ISO 15189. That means you anyways are confronted with verification as well as validation tasks. And probably you need to just handle the devices according to your quality management system, put them into certain lists, consider the recurrent maintenance cycles and all of these things which need to be done, and that's what need to be fulfilled. The thing where you need to be careful is really to be conservative. That means any change which you do with the system could potentially automatically lead you again to an in-house scenario. So never change a running system, keep it as it is always a good way, but if you need to change something, always take care not to deviate from the manufacturer's instructions, for example. In short, to sum it up, so where are the responsibilities? You have the manufacturers. They are fully responsible for the device itself and for the safety and effectiveness of it. They proved it via the conformity assessment procedure already and brought it on the market. So this is fully on their side. As a health institution or a laboratory, you are fully responsible for the correct application according to everything which is provided. So this is how it splits up at the end.
Mm-hmm. So this is a situation where most of the health institutions maybe are already most familiar with, but what about the in-house IVD cases now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked about the second scenario, which is exactly this deviation from the manufacturer's instructions that leads already to the in-house scenario. We still call it light scenario, not because everything is easy or simple, but in comparison to the other scenarios, it might seem a little bit lower from the level of activities, at least, or also from the risk it can provide. But this is already highly linked to the change itself. So normally what you do here is you have a CE-IVD product, a kit, for example, and you typically do not directly physically change this product. So you still take it out of the box, off the shelf, and you're using it, and even the technical part of the usage could be similar or the same, let's say, like the manufacturers provide. But what you're doing is here, as we already discussed before, what you explained, we change, for example, the intended purpose, or we deviate somewhere else in the instruction itself. Therefore, this new setup and this new environment needs to be validated. So in most cases, a validation might at least be considered. That you need to think of, okay, what was the change exactly and how could it affect my setup? What is the impact to be expected? And in this direction, you need to think and also to validate. So in most cases, I think that inherent technical properties do not change because you do not physically change the product. That also means that you're lucky in most cases. The general safety and performance requirements, which you need to check because you have an in-house device, the GSPRs from Annex 1 need to be checked anyways in every case then. They might stay the same. You still need to check them and tick them off in your documentation at least. So, and the other things like risk analysis, for example, risk management needs to be potentially adapted. If you, for example, extend the specimen type range to a new type of specimen, then you definitely need to consider maybe additional risks which come exactly with the handling of this type of specimen, like blood, for example. Or if you, for example, deviate somewhere in the performance domain, then you probably need to think of if this new setup would also still work, or maybe also you mentioned one case which is using a device after the expiry date, right? You need to prove that it still works even in that setup, and you need to find a way to demonstrate it, right? By testing it or doing quality checks, for example. One thing for sure, you need to have a documentation. We are here in the in-house scenario on that, and you need to justify also these adaptations, and you need to document it at the end.
So in summary, in this scenario, the health institutions are using a CE-IVD, so they are repurposing it, but still they are using a CE-IVD. So this means they still have some documentation that might help when generating the new technical documentation. But what would this mean now for laboratories that repurpose devices that are not originally a CE-IVD, so an RUO product? So what kind of actions are needed for those scenarios?
That's actually a very good point, because with the CE-IVDs, you at least get your declaration of conformity still. You might get some data or some information on some physical aspects, on electrical safety, for example. You can tick it off mentally. And this is normally, or in many cases, not the case with RUOs. Of course, it still depends, because even electrically RUO devices like instruments, they would be tested according to some suitable standards, for example, in this area, because it's an electrical device. And they even might bear a CE mark. Here you need to be careful. The CE mark not always means it's a CE-IVD. There are also other regulations and directives which can lead to a CE mark. So for example, for instruments, you still have a EMC directive or a low voltage directive, etc. And these devices bear a CE mark, but that does not necessarily mean it's an in-house IVD. For RUOs in general, they need to be somehow labeled still. And the thing with RUOs is, of course, they do not come with any clinical purpose at all. And legally, they are also therefore not forced that they need to provide you with any of this information, right? So it's fully up to you. You just take the RUO as kind of a black box. You try to get as much information as possible, but you need to draw your own conclusions from this kind of information. That means you need to map this to your own GSPR requirements from the Article 5.5, respective the Annex 1, and you need to try to tick off and explain and justify how this setup or these devices still leads to a compliant Annex 1 GSPR setup, right? So this is also the biggest challenge. So therefore, as a health institution, you need to provide appropriate analysis. You need to read through a lot of documents. You also need to think of, okay, how can I prove that? And wherever it is possible, I can use the documentation I have and try to map it to my GSPRs. But wherever there are gaps, and it's a given thing that there will be gaps somewhere, you need to find a way how to fill them, right? So either by justifying that there is a gap, that's still an option where you need to have a very good justification for, or you have different ways. For example, performing your validation is a very typical thing, right? So it's also a given thing that you need to validate this kind of setups, maybe even a little bit more comprehensive in comparison to other kind of scenarios. The risk analysis, you need to consider for RUOs, potentially no one did ever do a risk analysis on that product, at least not in your clinical setup or clinical context here. So therefore, you need to put a lot of effort also in the risk analysis of the integration of such an RUO device in relation to the diagnostic workflow. And last but not least, as always, the documentation part becomes a little bit bigger, I would say.
So what about the scenario where the health institution combines devices that were originally not intended by the manufacturer?
Yeah, this is the next one we discussed, our scenario number 4. If we are combining different devices, then I think it's pretty obvious that this combination needs to be safe and effective again, right? It's always the same thing, safety, effectiveness, the two sides of the scales, and we need to prove it. So that means that this combination must be validated, and this also entails not only individual devices, but the whole setup. Normally, if you're talking about a workflow, you do that anyways, right? You see it already as a system, and in most cases, you do the validation as an umbrella over the whole workflow or parts of the workflow. But also from the device perspective, you need to see it as a system which works together, which is connected somehow. And that means that you also need to consider the interfaces, for example. Do they really fit together? Sometimes it's really as simple as just a plug which you put together, or maybe the integrations in general, also software together with hardware, for example, these types of combinations, or a kit which physically should be put into a reader. It's also the same. It needs to be suitable to be put together. So physically needs to be put together, but also the interoperability aspects need to be somehow demonstrated. This is also clearly a requirement in the GSPRs. This must be demonstrated by the health institution that they are compatible and also in combination still are able and capable to fulfill the intended purpose which is described or prescribed by the health institution. And the safety of this combination must be guaranteed, something which sometimes is not as easy to find out, right? If you put together several instruments on one connector, then probably leak currents might be exceeding the limits which are allowed and so on, right? So sometimes you need to think a lot in this direction, but fortunately in most cases you can rely also on the documentation. So it's always important to look into the documentation provided by the individual devices of the manufacturers. And of course, as I said, the evidence level in the GSPRs might be a little bit higher because you need to consider not only individual devices, but really the whole setup in combination. All right, and we had one more scenario, which is the last one. And here, I think from the mindset itself, if you're really falling in this scenario as a health institution, you need to have a mindset like already very close to an IVD manufacturer in some cases. If you, for example, create a software product, then you need to create this software product according to the state of the art, as always. And for that purpose, you would find a lot of standards already available, right? So this is something one would expect that you consider that. Maybe if you have manufacturing processes, you need to have this manufacturing process also in your QMS, and keep in mind 15189 is a requirement which is a hard requirement by the Article 5.5, but might, especially in this case, not be sufficient if you have more processes like design, development, manufacturing. These are typically not covered by an ISO 15189, and therefore you need just to steal them from a different set of standards, for example, like the ISO 13485 as a famous example in the medical device development. It all ends up with a very high documentation effort at the end, but I think this is clear because you're really very close already to the manufacturer's world with this scenario. From the performance evaluation, very similar to manufacturers. I mean, it's your device. You really developed and created it. So therefore, you need to perform all of the things which are needed in a pretty comprehensive way, I would say. The risk analysis from the beginning, maybe even including your manufacturing processes and maybe even your developing processes. You need to potentially introduce more SOPs, as already said, on this development process, on the manufacturing processes, etc., how to perform the quality checks and everything which is applicable. But still, it's an in-house device. So still, the benefit is, if you would see it as a benefit, that you do not need to involve a notified body as an external party, for example. You just apply it within your own health institution, and it's still your own product. Okay, I think that was pretty complex, but also pretty complete now. So I would like to sum this up now for us and also for the audience. The 5 scenarios, to have them at one glance. We talked about scenario 1, right? Just to sum it up, this is a non-in-house IVD case. This is the case where we have CE-marked devices and we apply them fully accordingly to the instructions for use from the manufacturers, right? You gave nice examples here, and we talked also about the activities which you need to do or not need to do here. In scenario 2, we talked about having a device which is a CE-marked device, but not applied according to the intended purpose given by the manufacturer, but deviating from it. So as a laboratory, you could, for example, make a change in the volume of the application, etc. The examples you gave. And we also talked about what to do here. So it's more focusing on the things which you did change here and how it could impact, in most cases, your performance, and therefore a revalidation is a very typical thing here to consider. Scenario 3 is very similar, right? So it was the ARIOS scenario where you repurpose, but that's not a CE-marked device, but really a non-CE-marked device, a research use only device. And that means that you have to again consider what are the changes exactly and what needs to be done here. Number 4 was the one with the connections with the system building. So how to combine different devices into one larger device or system, especially the interfaces were mentioned here as a very specific topic. And last but not least, scenario 5, we were talking about a scenario where you really take over the whole design, development, manufacturing of a device, where you are already very close to very typical EU CE manufacturer, let's say.
So I would also like to talk about the regulatory landscape for the in-house IVD. So in general, the in-house IVDs are explicitly regulated. And as mentioned, the in-house IVD privilege is only applicable for a health institution within the EU. And it is also important to highlight that once you're manufacturing and using in-house IVDs, your health institution definitely needs to show the compliance to ISO 15189. And another very relevant standard is the ISO 5649. And on top of that, so obviously you have to set up the technical documentation for your respective in-house IVD. And as mentioned, the competent authorities of the member states are responsible for surveillance. And next up, so I mentioned that Article 5.5 of the IVDR is applicable for the in-house IVDs. But this is obviously very generic. So what does this mean in more detail? So what are the specific requirements of the Article 5.5?
Yeah, so about this topic, I also want to refer to other webinars we did already in the past, but just very briefly, for every in-house device, we have the requirements which are listed in the Article 5.5. We tried to sum them up. It's maybe pretty condensed. We also do not need to walk through them. But first of all, we see that we have a certain timeline. Some of the requirements are applicable or have been applicable since May 2022 already. So after the transition period has been gone. Then we had a bunch of requirements, the big amount of the requirements here in blue, which is now already applicable since a little bit more than a year. And this block came with a lot of requirements on the quality management systems, as we already discussed, 15189 and other topics, but also on documentational requirements, right? So just to demonstrate and prove certain things. And there is another one which has been postponed a little bit to the back, end of 2030. And this is the justification why you're using in-house devices if there are already CE-marked devices potentially on the market which fulfill potentially the same purpose. Then you need to justify why you're still using them, for example, because your specific patient needs cannot be met. But this is still in the future. So at the moment, it's not a mismatch. It's not a it's not a fight between those two groups, let's say.
So we also brought some practical recommendations for you. So if you are a health institution that is wondering where to start when it comes to the technical documentation of your respective in-house IVD, we have 5 steps basically. So the first step would be that you have to define the product and the system that you use as a diagnostic test. In the second step, you should then classify it based on the scenario, and you do this step in order to find out if there is even an in-house IVD present. And in the third step, you would then derive the necessary activities, and you would also have a look at what kind of standards are relevant for your situation. So as mentioned, the different standards. And then in the next step, you would start implement all of the requirements that are needed according to Article 5.5. And for this, you should always progress in a risk-oriented and also in a scenario-based way. And obviously, if you are not documenting it, then it did not happen. So this means, once again, to highlight everything that you are doing always needs to be thoroughly documented. And as a last step, you are also responsible for the continuous monitoring. So in case there are any changes, it must definitely be checked if the regulatory requirements are still going to be met. So this would be it for the more theoretical side of it, but let's have a look at in what way Platomics can actually provide support for you.
Yeah, thank you for these recommendations. I think it's also important to mention that all of these scenarios we just mentioned, in reality, they happen very often in a mixed style, right? So in many cases, or in most cases, you don't find only one scenario, but maybe a combination, maybe out of 2 or even 3 different scenarios. That's in reality. And based on this, as you said, you need to set up your strategy in how to put it, how to start with the documentation, and so on. Yeah, and I mean, we as Platomics, we would be very happy to also help you with some of the aspects. We provide certain solutions for that. As I already said, we are providing a software product that fully guides you through all of these processes. So through the process of the creation of the documentation, but also in gathering the relevant information with a high grade of automation that really saves a lot of time and also resources in that way in the regulatory domain, hopefully as well. We also come up with features like community templates, which we already discussed, right? This sharing of the setups of these workflows that would even more speed up your setup if you have a suitable template. And last but not least, I also just want to quickly mention our academy. This academy also helps you in learning and understanding the regulatory topics, especially from the point of view of a laboratory. So all we do is really trying to empowering labs by different activities like giving guidance, providing training and education on demand in our digital systems. And at the end, it should help to get a time-saving and also a budget-friendly solution for you. If you want to learn more about our activities and what we are providing at Platomics, I would be very happy if you want to have a look onto our website. You can either use the URL on the bottom here and directly surf to platomics.com, or you can use the QR code for that as well. And we have a dedicated page as well for the Play2X Academy, which I just mentioned. We can get digital trainings, which are even CPD certified. Good. And with that, I need to have a look onto the time. I think we are already over time. I see that we have 2 questions. We can maybe take one question. Valerie, let's take one question, and the other questions we can follow up afterwards. We will follow up with the other questions. The first question we had here is, we are a laboratory focused on immunohistochemistry and use antibodies on a regular basis. What does it mean in practice if we decide to change the incubation period? I think this question is focusing on the scenario number 2, maybe.
Exactly. So the short answer would be that you definitely fall into the in-house IVD scenario. So as Andreas mentioned, in this case, it would be scenario 2. And this would also be the case, for example, if you change different parameters such as the matrix. And the recommendation for this scenario would be that you, in practice, do a risk assessment and then find out if a verification is enough, or if you need to go more in depth and also do a validation. And in general, all of the Article 5.5 requirements are basically applicable for you.
So short answer, yes, you're an in-house
Yes,
device.
exactly.
We need to work on that, and that means that they need to document it, especially. Okay. Good. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think we are already out of time. I hope that the webinar served your purpose and it helped you in understanding a little bit more about the granularities in the different scenarios. Thank you, Valerie, for the insights you gave also and for your expert knowledge here. Yeah, if you have any more questions, please reach out. You can contact us at any time, and we will definitely follow up with the rest of the questions. Thank you very much and have a nice afternoon.
Thanks for joining.